The sedatives had worn off too early. Sebastian's eyes fluttered open just as I pressed the pillow against his face, and for one terrifying moment, I saw recognition flash across his features. Not the confused, delusional stare that had haunted me for months, but the clear, desperate understanding of a man who knew exactly what was happening to him. "Anna," he whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the white cotton. "Please, I know what I've become. I'm sorry." My hands trembled, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Not when we'd come this far, not when my children's future hung in the balance, not when I finally had the courage to do what should have been done years ago. "I'm so sorry, Sebastian," I whispered back, tears streaming down my cheeks. "But this is the only way to set us all free." His struggles grew weaker, and then stopped altogether. The heart monitor's steady beep dissolved into a single, endless tone that seemed to echo through my soul. If you're watching this suffering in silence at the hands of an abusive man, I want you to know you're stronger than you think. And if I, at 86 years old, managed to change my destiny after decades of abuse, trauma, and madness, you can too. My name is Anna Flowers, but everyone here in Canton, Missouri knows me as Miss Annie. I'm telling you this story not because I'm proud of what I did, but because I've learned that sometimes salvation comes through the darkest paths, and sometimes the only way to save the people you love is to damn yourself in the process. This is the story I've kept buried for 12 years. A story of love twisted into obsession, of family loyalty corrupted into destruction, and of the terrible choice between mercy and murder that changed everything. I was born in 1938 in a cramped house along the Mississippi River, when Canton was nothing more than a cluster of weathered buildings hugging the muddy banks. My father, Thomas Flowers, spent his days hauling catfish and carp from the murky waters, his hands permanently stained with river mud and fish scales. My mother, Sarah, took in sewing from the wealthier families across town, her fingers dancing across fabric late into the night by the light of kerosene lamps. We were 6 children, sharing 2 beds in a single room, the sound of the river, our constant lullaby. Breakfast was usually cornbread and whatever fish hadn't sold the day before, but somehow our small house overflowed with laughter and love. My parents might not have had money, but they had each other, and they made sure we knew we were cherished. Annie. My mother would say, as she brushed my long brown hair each morning, "Remember that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in how much love you can give and receive." Those words would come back to haunt me years later, when I learned that love could be as destructive as it was healing. The September County Fair was the highlight of our year, when Canton transformed from a sleepy river town into a carnival of lights, music, and possibilities. The whole community came together, rich and poor, young and old, united in celebration. It was at the 1954 fair, when I was 16 and wearing my best dress, a blue cotton number with tiny white flowers that my mother had spent weeks sewing, that I first encountered Sebastian Canoe. I was standing near the ring toss booth watching children try to win stuffed animals when a warm voice spoke behind me. "Excuse me, miss, but aren't you the prettiest thing this side of the Mississippi?" I turned to see a young man with dark hair and eyes that sparkled with mischief and intelligence. He was older than me, maybe 22, and everything about him spoke of money and refinement. His clothes were obviously tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never wanted for anything. "I'm Sebastian Canoe," he said, extending a manicured hand. "And you must be Anna Flowers. I've been watching you all evening, trying to work up the courage to introduce myself." "You know who I am?" I asked, surprised that someone from the prominent Canoe family would know a fisherman's daughter. "Honey, every young man in Canton knows who you are," he replied with a grin that made my heart flutter. "The question is, would you do me the honor of a dance?" Before I could respond, he was leading me toward the makeshift dance floor where couples swayed to the music of a local bluegrass band. His hand was warm and confident in mine, and when he pulled me close, I caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something distinctly masculine. As we moved to the rhythm of the fiddles and guitars, Sebastian leaned close and whispered in my ear, "Brown-eyed girl from the river town. My heart's become a boat, sailing on your smile, Anna Flowers gets my vote." The couples around us stopped dancing to listen, clapping and cheering when he finished. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and pleasure, but all I could focus on were his eyes, warm, intense, and completely focused on me, as if I were the only person in the world. That was beautiful," I managed to say, my voice barely audible above the music. "Just wait until you hear what I write when I really know you," he replied, spinning me around as the song came to an end. We spent the rest of the evening together, sharing cotton candy and caramel apples, riding the Ferris wheel, where he pointed out his family's sprawling property along River Street and talking about everything and nothing. Sebastian was charming, funny, and incredibly well-read. He quoted Shakespeare and Mark Twain with equal ease and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. "You're not like other girls," he told me as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, the lights of the fair twinkling behind us. "Most of them just want to talk about dresses and gossip. But you have depth, intelligence. You see the world differently." I was completely smitten. Here was this sophisticated, handsome man from the most prominent family in town, and he was telling me I was special. After a childhood of hand-me-down clothes and fish-for-dinner poverty, Sebastian's attention felt like a fairy tale come to life. When he walked me home that night, he paused at our front gate and took my hands in his. "Anna Flowers," he said solemnly, "I want to court you properly with your father's permission and your mother's blessing. Would you like that?" I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Good." He smiled, raising my hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Because I have the feeling you're going to change my life." If only I had known how prophetic those words would prove to be. Sebastian courted me with the intensity and thoroughness that he would later apply to every obsession in his life. Flowers arrived at our door every few days, not the wildflowers I was used to picking along the riverbank, but expensive roses and lilies from the florist in St. Louis. He brought chocolates imported from Belgium, books of poetry, with my favorite passages marked in his neat handwriting, and small pieces of jewelry that my mother locked away for safekeeping. "Anna," my father said one evening after Sebastian had left following another elaborate evening of dinner and dancing, "that young man seems mighty taken with you." "I know, Papa. Isn't it wonderful?" My father's weathered face creased with concern. "Just remember, honey, that the rich and the poor don't always mix well. That boy comes from a different world than ours." "But Sebastian doesn't care about that," I protested. "He loves me for who I am." "Maybe so," my father replied gently. "But love isn't always enough to bridge certain gaps. Just be careful, Annie. Don't lose yourself trying to become someone you're not." At the time, I thought my father was being overly cautious, maybe even jealous of Sebastian's obvious advantages. I couldn't understand how anyone could see danger in such devoted affection. Sebastian made me feel beautiful, intelligent, and worthy of the kind of love I'd only read about in novels. Our courtship lasted 2 years, during which Sebastian gradually introduced me to his world. The Canoe family lived in a massive Victorian mansion on River Street, complete with wraparound porches, stained glass windows, and manicured gardens that required a full-time groundskeeper. The house itself was impressive enough, but it was Sebastian's father who truly commanded attention. Orlando Canoe Sr. was everything a patriarch should be, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. He always dressed impeccably in white linen suits and Panama hats, and he spoke with the cultured accent of someone who had received the finest education money could buy. He owned the most successful shipping operation on this stretch of the Mississippi, with a fleet of boats that carried goods between St. Louis and New Orleans. Miss Anna," he said the first time Sebastian brought me to dinner, rising from his chair and taking my hand with old-world gallantry. "Sebastian has told me so much about you. Please consider our home your home. I was charmed by his attention and kindness. Here was a man who could have looked down on my humble origins, but instead treated me like visiting royalty. He asked thoughtful questions about my family, my interests, and my dreams for the future, listening to my answers with the same attention he might give to important business matters. What I didn't understand then was that Orlando Sr.'s interest in me wasn't paternal affection, it was evaluation. He was determining whether I would be a suitable addition to his carefully controlled world, whether I could be molded into the kind of wife who would complement his son without interfering with their unusually close relationship. Sebastian worshipped his father with an intensity that should have worried me. Every conversation began with, "Dad says," or "Dad thinks," and I never saw him make a decision, not even about what to wear or eat, without first considering what Orlando Sr. would approve of. Sebastian, I said one afternoon as we walked along the riverfront, "Don't you ever want to make your own choices, form your own opinions?" He looked at me with genuine confusion. Why would I want to do that when I have Dad to guide me? He's lived longer, experienced, more, built everything we have. It would be foolish and arrogant to ignore his wisdom. But what about your own wisdom? Your own instincts? My instincts led me to you, he said, pulling me close. And Dad approves completely. So I'd say my instincts are pretty good. I smiled and let him kiss me, but something cold settled in my stomach. Even in choosing me, Sebastian needed his father's approval. What would happen if Orlando Sr. ever disapproved of something I did or said? The wedding in June of 1956 was everything a young girl could dream of and more. The church was packed, with the most prominent families in Canton, and beyond the reception was held at the country club with an orchestra imported from St. Louis, and my dress was a creation of silk and lace that cost more than my father made in 6 months. Orlando Sr. spared no expense, treating the occasion as if I were his own daughter. He walked me down the aisle when my father, overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all, stumbled during the rehearsal. He gave a toast at the reception that brought tears to everyone's eyes, welcoming me officially into the Canoe family and promising that I would always be cherished and protected. To Anna, he said, raising his champagne glass, who has brought light and joy into our lives. May she always know how precious she is to us. I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. Sebastian and I moved into a beautiful 2-story house on River Street, just a few hundred yards from Orlando Sr.'s mansion. The house was a wedding gift from my new father-in-law, fully furnished with antiques and artwork that spoke of both wealth and refined taste. My favorite room was the sunroom, which overlooked the Mississippi and caught the morning light perfectly. "This will be perfect for our children," Sebastian said as we toured the nursery Orlando Sr. had already had prepared. Dad had the same wallpaper in his nursery when he was a boy. It's tradition. Our first child was born in 1958, and there was never any question about the name. Orlando Jr. was Sebastian's choice, or rather, Orlando Sr.'s choice, made through Sebastian. I had suggested other names, family names, from my side, but Sebastian dismissed them gently but firmly. "Dad's so excited about having a grandson carry on the family name," he explained. "And after everything he's done for us, don't you think we owe him that much?" Little Orlando was a beautiful baby, healthy and happy, and I fell in love with him the moment the doctor placed him in my arms. Sebastian was a devoted father, but even in his parenting, I could see Orlando Sr.'s influence. Every decision about feeding schedules, sleeping arrangements, and childcare routines was made in consultation with his father. "Sebastian," I said one day when Orlando Jr. was about 6 months old, "I've been thinking about starting him on solid foods. Mrs. Patterson down the street says her babies did much better when she started them on vegetables first." "Let me ask Dad what he thinks," Sebastian replied automatically. "He raised me, so he must know what works." "But I'm his mother. Don't you think I should have some say in how we raise our own child?" Sebastian looked at me with that same confused expression I'd seen before. "Of course you have a say, Annie. But Dad has experience, and experience is valuable. Why would we ignore good advice just to be stubborn? I couldn't argue with his logic, but something inside me bristled at the assumption that I, as the child's mother, needed another man's permission to make decisions about my own baby's care. Marina arrived in 1960, Sebastian Jr. in 1962, and little Marianne in 1965. With each child, Orlando Sr.'s presence in our lives grew stronger and more pervasive. He had opinions about everything: their names, their schedules, their discipline, their education. And Sebastian deferred to him on every single matter. "The children need more structure," Orlando Sr. would say during his daily visits to our house. "Children without proper discipline grow up wild and disrespectful." "Yes, Dad," Sebastian would agree immediately. "What do you suggest?" "Earlier bedtimes, no dessert unless they finish everything on their plates, and absolutely no tolerance for backtalk or crying." I watched these exchanges with growing unease. Orlando Sr. wasn't being malicious. He genuinely seemed to care about the children's well-being. But his idea of child rearing was rigid and old-fashioned, and I worried about the effects of such strict discipline on our little ones. Sebastian. I tried to discuss it with my husband one evening after the children were asleep. "Don't you think Dad might be a little too strict? Marina is only 5 years old. It seems harsh to punish her for crying when she's scared." "Dad raised me with those same principles, and I turned out fine," Sebastian replied, not looking up from the business papers he was reviewing. "Discipline builds character. But what if we tried a gentler approach? What if we—" "Annie." Sebastian's voice carried a warning tone I'd never heard before. "Dad knows what he's doing. He successfully raised a child, built a business empire, and earned the respect of this entire community. I think we can trust his judgment." The conversation was over, and I was left feeling frustrated and unheard in my own home. Orlando Sr.'s control extended far beyond child rearing. He made decisions about Sebastian's role in the family business, our social obligations, even the color of paint for our living room. Sebastian never questioned these choices, never asserted his own preferences, never acted like an independent adult with his own family to consider. The breaking point came when Marina was diagnosed with a heart murmur at age 7. The local doctor in Canton recommended that we take her to a specialist in St. Louis for further evaluation and possible treatment. "I'll make the appointment immediately," I told Sebastian. "Dr. Patterson said time could be important with these types of conditions." "Wait." Sebastian set his hand on my arm. "Let's talk to Dad first. He might know a better specialist or have a different recommendation." "Sebastian, this is our daughter's health we're talking about. Why do we need anyone else's permission to get her medical care?" "It's not about permission," he insisted. "It's about making sure we're making the best possible decision. Dad has connections in St. Louis that we don't have. He might be able to get us in with a better doctor." "And what if Dad is out of town? What if we can't reach him? Do we just let Marina suffer while we wait for his advice?" Sebastian's face darkened. "Dad wouldn't want Marina to suffer. He loves her as much as we do. But not more than we do," I shot back. "She's our child, Sebastian, our responsibility. And Dad is my father," Sebastian replied with a finality that chilled me. "I won't make major decisions without his input. That's final." Orlando Sr. returned from his business trip 3 days later, 3 days during which Marina's condition worsened, and I paced the floors helpless to get my own child the medical care she needed. When he finally gave his blessing for the trip to St. Louis, it was with specific instructions about which doctor to see, which hotel to stay in, and how long we should remain in the city. Marina's surgery went well, thank God, but the experience opened my eyes to the true nature of our family dynamic. Sebastian wasn't just respectful of his father, he was completely dependent on him. And that dependence was putting our children at risk. As the years passed, I watched Sebastian's independence erode even further. He couldn't choose a restaurant for dinner without considering what Orlando Sr. would prefer. He wouldn't buy clothes without his father's approval of the style and color. He even asked Orlando Sr.'s opinion on intimate matters that should have remained between husband and wife. Sebastian, I said one night after Orlando Sr. had spent the evening lecturing us about our sleeping arrangements. Don't you find it strange that your father has opinions about our bedroom habits? He's just concerned about our health and happiness, Sebastian replied, missing the point entirely. Did you know that he and mother used to sleep in separate beds? He says it improved their relationship tremendously. Your mother died when you were 10 years old, I pointed out. How much could you really remember about their relationship? Sebastian's expression grew cold. I remember everything about my mother, and Dad has told me many stories about their perfect marriage. If separate beds worked for them, maybe we should consider it. I stared at my husband in disbelief. Sebastian, are you seriously suggesting that we rearrange our marriage based on your father's memories of a relationship that ended 30 years ago? I'm suggesting that we should be open to advice from someone who has more experience than we do. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had happened to the charming, confident man I'd married. Where was the Sebastian who had written me poetry and promised to love me forever? When had he become this hollow shell who couldn't function without his father's constant guidance? The answer came to me gradually through small observations and overheard conversations. Sebastian hadn't changed. He had never been independent to begin with. Orlando Sr. had raised him to be dependent, to need constant approval and direction, to be incapable of functioning as an autonomous adult. What I had interpreted as close family bonds was actually something much more sinister, a father who had deliberately stunted his son's emotional growth to ensure that Sebastian would never leave him. And now I was trapped in the web as well expected to defer not just to my husband, but to my father-in-law, who saw our entire family as extensions of his own will. The first real crack in Orlando Sr.'s facade came in 1968 when he suffered a mild heart attack. I was at the hospital with Sebastian when the doctor delivered the diagnosis, and I watched my father-in-law's face transform from its usual composed mask into something approaching panic. How serious is it? Orlando Sr. demanded. What are my chances? What kind of treatment do I need? Mr. Canoe, you're going to be fine, Dr. Morrison assured him. This was a very minor episode. With some lifestyle changes and medication, there's no reason you can't live for many more years. But Orlando Sr. wasn't satisfied with that reassurance. Over the following weeks, he consulted with specialists in St. Louis, Chicago, and even flew to the Mayo Clinic for additional opinions. He hired a private nurse, bought expensive monitoring equipment, and turned his house into a medical facility. Sebastian's reaction was even more extreme. He moved into Orlando Sr.'s house, temporarily sleeping on a cot next to his father's bed, checking his pulse and blood pressure every few hours, recording every symptom and medication in a detailed log. Sebastian, I pleaded with him after a week of this behavior. You need to come home. The children miss you, and I need your help with them. The children have you? He replied without looking up from his medical charts. Dad only has me. If something happens to him because I wasn't here to monitor his condition, I'll never forgive myself. But the doctor said he's going to be fine. This level of surveillance isn't necessary. Sebastian finally looked at me, and I was shocked by what I saw in his eyes. It wasn't just concern, it was raw, desperate terror. You don't understand, he whispered. If Dad dies, I don't know what I'll do. He's everything to me. He's the center of my world. What about us? I asked quietly. What about your wife and children? Aren't we important to you? Of course you're important, Sebastian said quickly. But it's different with Dad. He's part of me. Losing him would be like losing half of myself. That was the moment I realized that my husband was not just dependent on his father. He was psychologically merged with him. In Sebastian's mind, he and Orlando Sr. were not two separate people, but two parts of the same entity. And if one part died, the other would cease to exist as well. Orlando Sr. recovered from his heart attack, but the experience changed the dynamic in our family permanently. Sebastian's obsessive caregiving became the new normal, and I found myself essentially a single mother, raising 4 children, while my husband devoted himself entirely to his father's health and comfort. "Dad needs me," became Sebastian's answer to every request, every plea, every attempt to reclaim some small piece of his attention. The children's school plays, birthday parties, and bedtime stories all took second place to Orlando Sr.'s blood pressure readings and medication schedules. I tried to be understanding. I told myself that Sebastian was just being a good son, that his devotion was admirable, even if it was excessive. But as months turned into years, I began to see the toll this arrangement was taking on our children. Orlando Jr., now 10 years old, had become withdrawn and rebellious. He acted out at school, got into fights with other children, and seemed to resent both his father's absence and his grandfather's omnipresence. "Why does Grandpa get to make all the rules?" he asked me one day, after Orlando Sr. had canceled a planned fishing trip because he didn't feel well enough to be left alone. "Grandpa doesn't make all the rules, honey," I replied, though we both knew it was a lie. "Yes, he does," Orlando Jr. said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Dad doesn't do anything unless Grandpa says it's okay. Even you have to ask Grandpa's permission for stuff." Marina, now 8, had developed anxiety that manifested in stomach aches and nightmares. She would wake up crying in the middle of the night, convinced that something terrible was going to happen to our family. When I asked her what she was afraid of, her answer broke my heart. "I'm scared that Grandpa is going to die, and then Daddy will die too, and then we'll be all alone." Even at 8 years old, Marina could sense the unhealthy dynamic that was slowly destroying our family. The younger children, Sebastian Jr. and Marianne, seemed to adapt better to the situation, but only because they had never known anything different. To them, it was normal for Grandpa to be the ultimate authority, normal for Daddy to disappear for days at a time, to take care of medical crises, normal for Mommy to handle everything else alone. I began to feel like a widow whose husband was still alive, physically present, but emotionally absent, committed to another relationship that took precedence over our marriage and family. It was during this period that I started noticing troubling changes in Orlando Sr.'s second wife, Constance. She had married Orlando Sr. when Sebastian was 20, a beautiful woman from St. Louis, who seemed delighted to become part of a prominent family. But over the years, I watched her vitality drain away like water from a cracked vessel. Constance spoke less and less at family gatherings, often sitting silently through entire meals without contributing to the conversation. When she did speak, it was usually to agree with whatever Orlando Sr. had just said, or to make polite inquiries about the children's health and schoolwork. I tried to reach out to her, inviting her for coffee or shopping trips, but she always declined with vague excuses about household duties or Orlando Sr.'s needs. The few times I managed to catch her alone, she seemed nervous and distracted, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Constance," I said to her one afternoon when I found her sitting alone in her garden, staring at the river with empty eyes, "is everything all right? You seem troubled lately." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, fear, sadness, and something that might have been desperation. "Everything is fine, dear," she replied in a voice that suggested the opposite. "Just tired, that's all. Maybe you should see a doctor. You haven't seemed like yourself lately." "Orlando handles all medical matters," she said quickly. "He knows what's best for my health." There was something in her tone that sent a chill down my spine, but before I could pursue the conversation further, Orlando Sr. appeared on the porch, calling for Constance to come inside. "Coming, dear," she said, rising immediately and smoothing her dress. As she walked toward the house, I noticed her hands were shaking. The years between 1970 and 1975 were a slow descent into a nightmare that I was powerless to stop. Orlando Sr.'s health continued to decline. Diabetes joined his heart problems. His vision began to fail, and his once sharp mind started showing signs of confusion and memory loss. Each new symptom, each small decline sent Sebastian deeper into his obsessive caregiving. He installed medical equipment throughout Orlando Sr.'s house, hired a rotating team of private nurses, and consulted with specialists from around the country. The family shipping business, which had been thriving for decades, began to suffer from Sebastian's neglect. Mr. Canoe. Our business manager, Jim Walsh, came to me one afternoon looking desperate. I need to talk to someone about the company's finances. We have boats sitting idle, contracts going unfulfilled, and creditors calling every day. But I can't get 5 minutes of your husband's attention. What do you need him to decide? I asked, though I already knew I had no authority to make business decisions. Everything, Jim replied. Payroll, repairs, new contracts, insurance claims. The company is hemorrhaging money, and if we don't make some decisions soon, we're going to lose everything. I promised to talk to Sebastian, but when I approached him about the business crisis, he brushed off my concerns with frightening indifference. The business will survive, he said without looking up from Orlando Sr.'s medical charts. Dad built it to last. Right now, his health is more important than profits. Sebastian, we employ 30 people. Their families depend on the income from this company. Don't you think we owe them some consideration? Dad would say that loyalty to family comes before loyalty to employees. Sebastian replied, when he's better, we'll rebuild whatever needs rebuilding. But Orlando Sr. wasn't getting better. His diabetes worsened, requiring insulin injections and constant monitoring of his blood sugar. His heart condition necessitated multiple medications that left him weak and confused. And most troubling of all, his mental clarity began to fade in ways that couldn't be attributed to medication or physical illness. Sebastian. Orlando Sr. said one morning, looking directly at his son with confusion. Who are you? Are you the doctor? I've been waiting for the doctor to come check on me. I watched Sebastian's face crumble as he realized his father didn't recognize him. It's me, Dad. It's Sebastian, your son. Orlando Sr. studied Sebastian's face for a long moment, then shook his head. I don't have a son named Sebastian. My son's name is Thomas, and he's just a little boy. He should be getting ready for school. Sebastian spent the rest of that day showing Orlando Sr. photographs repeating stories from their shared past, desperately trying to awaken some spark of recognition. But the episodes of confusion became more frequent and more severe. It's just the medication, Sebastian insisted to anyone who would listen. Once we adjust his prescriptions, his mind will clear up. But I could see the truth that Sebastian refused to acknowledge Orlando Sr. was developing dementia, and no amount of medical intervention was going to restore the sharp, commanding man he had once been. Sebastian's response to his father's mental decline was to intensify his caregiving to an almost manic degree. He moved permanently into Orlando Sr.'s house, sleeping in a chair next to the old man's bed, monitoring every breath, every movement, every change in expression. Sebastian. I pleaded with him during one of his rare visits home. You can't continue like this. You're not eating, you're not sleeping, and you're making yourself sick with worry. I'm fine, he insisted, though his appearance suggested otherwise. He had lost at least 20 pounds, his eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion, and his hands shook from too much caffeine and too little rest. The children need their father, I continued. Marina is having panic attacks, Orlando Jr. is getting into trouble at school, and the little ones ask for you constantly. The children have you, Sebastian said dismissively. Dad only has me. If I'm not there to take care of him, who will? The nurses, the doctors, the medical professionals you've hired? They don't love him the way I do, Sebastian replied with an intensity that frightened me. They're just doing a job. But for me, taking care of Dad it's who I am. It's my purpose. That was the moment I realized that Sebastian's identity had become so completely merged with his role as Orlando Sr.'s caregiver that he literally didn't know who he would be without it. His entire sense of self was wrapped up in being needed by his father, and the thought of losing that role was more terrifying to him than the thought of losing his marriage, his children, or his own health. The end came gradually then, all at once. Orlando Sr.'s physical condition deteriorated throughout 1975, with multiple hospitalizations and increasingly complex medical requirements. But it was the complete loss of his mental faculties that finally broke Sebastian's grip on reality. Dad doesn't recognize me anymore, Sebastian told me one evening, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. He thinks I'm a stranger. Sometimes he's afraid of me, Anna. My own father is afraid of me. I reached out to comfort him, but he pulled away. It's not natural, he continued, his voice taking on a manic edge. Dad was the smartest man I ever knew. His mind was like a steel trap. This confusion, this forgetfulness. Someone is doing this to him. Sebastian, no one is doing anything to him. This is what happens when people get old. Their minds sometimes fail along with their bodies. No, Sebastian said firmly. Someone is poisoning him, or maybe the doctors are giving him the wrong medications on purpose. There has to be an explanation that makes sense. I stared at my husband, horrified by what I was hearing. Sebastian was creating conspiracy theories to avoid accepting the simple, terrible truth that his father was dying of old age and illness. Who would want to hurt your father? I asked, gently hoping to guide him back to reality. People who are jealous of what he's built. Competitors who want to take over the shipping business. Maybe even some of the employees who think they deserve more money. Sebastian's paranoia grew worse over the following months. He installed security cameras around Orlando Sr.'s house, hired private investigators to look into the backgrounds of the nursing staff, and began keeping detailed logs of everyone who entered or left the property. The children were frightened of their father during his increasingly rare visits home. He would interrogate them about conversations they'd had with neighbors, demand to know if anyone had asked questions about their grandfather's health, and accuse me of not being vigilant enough about potential threats to the family. Daddy's scary now, little Marianne whispered to me one night after Sebastian had spent an hour checking all the locks and windows in our house. Why is he so angry all the time? I didn't know how to answer her. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that her father is losing his mind along with his father? The final crisis came in March of 1976. I received a frantic phone call from one of Orlando Sr.'s nurses saying that I needed to come to the house immediately. I found Sebastian in Orlando Sr.'s bedroom covered in blood and holding a kitchen knife. Orlando Sr. was unconscious in his bed with what appeared to be defensive wounds on his arms and hands. Sebastian, what happened? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm despite my terror. I caught him, Sebastian said with wild eyes. I caught the intruder who's been poisoning Dad. He was trying to inject something into Dad's IV line. I looked around the room and saw no signs of any intruder. The nurse cowered in the corner, clearly traumatized by whatever she had witnessed. Sebastian, there's no one else here, I said gently. You're holding a knife and your father is hurt. I need you to put the knife down so we can help him. You don't believe me, Sebastian said, his voice cracking. You think I hurt Dad, but I could never. He looked down at his blood-covered hands as if seeing them for the first time, then at the knife, then at his father's wounded form. The realization of what he had done seemed to hit him all at once. Oh God, he whispered. Oh God, what have I done? The knife clattered to the floor as Sebastian collapsed, sobbing hysterically. I rushed to check on Orlando Sr., who was alive but badly injured. The nurse called for an ambulance while I tried to comfort my husband, who was alternating between denial and self-recrimination. I didn't mean to hurt him, Sebastian kept repeating. I was trying to protect him. There was someone else here, I swear there was someone else. But the police investigation found no evidence of any intruder. Sebastian had apparently become so paranoid and delusional that he had attacked his own father, believing he was defending him from an imaginary threat. Orlando Sr. survived his injuries, but the trauma accelerated his decline. Within weeks, he required constant sedation and round-the-clock medical supervision. Sebastian was placed under psychiatric observation and diagnosed with acute psychosis brought on by prolonged stress and sleep deprivation. Mrs. Canoe. Dr. Richards, the psychiatrist treating Sebastian, explained to me, "Your husband has suffered a complete psychological break. His sense of reality has become severely distorted, and he poses a danger to himself and others." "Will he recover?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "It's impossible to say. With proper medication and therapy, some patients with similar conditions do improve. But given the severity of his symptoms and the traumatic trigger event, the prognosis is uncertain." Sebastian was transferred to a psychiatric facility in Jefferson City, where he would remain for the foreseeable future. I was left alone to care for 4 children, manage a failing business, and somehow hold together what remained of our shattered family. The first few months after Sebastian's hospitalization were a blur of practical necessities and emotional survival. I had to learn to run the shipping company, make decisions about Orlando Sr.'s medical care, help the children cope with their father's absence, and deal with the whispers and stares that followed our family wherever we went in Canton. "How are you holding up, Anna?" Dr. Morrison asked during one of Orlando Sr.'s checkups. He was one of the few people in town who treated me with genuine compassion rather than morbid curiosity. "I'm managing," I replied, though we both knew it was barely true. "And the children? They're adjusting. It's hard for them to understand why their father can't come home." Dr. Morrison nodded sympathetically. "Have you considered that it might be better if Sebastian doesn't come home? At least not until he's made significant progress in his treatment." The suggestion shocked me, even though I had been thinking the same thing. "He's my husband, Dr. Morrison. He's their father."
"Yes, but he's also a man who attacked his own father in a psychotic episode. The Sebastian who hurt Orlando Sr. is not the same man you married Anna, and there's no guarantee that the treatment will bring back the man you remember."
I knew he was right, but admitting it felt like a betrayal of my marriage vows and my family's future. Orlando Sr. died in his sleep 6 months later in September of 1976. His body weakened by age, illness, and the trauma of Sebastian's attack simply gave up the fight. I was with him at the end, holding his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped. Despite everything that had happened, despite the control and manipulation that had defined his relationship with Sebastian, I felt genuine sadness at Orlando Sr.'s passing. He had been a complicated man, loving and generous in some ways, but possessive and controlling in others. His death marked the end of an era for our family, and I wasn't sure what would come next. I called the psychiatric facility to inform Sebastian of his father's death, and the response was everything I had feared it would be. No," Sebastian said flatly when Dr. Richards delivered the news. "That's not possible. Dad can't be dead. He promised he would never leave me."
"Sebastian," Dr. Richards said gently, "your father was very ill. His death was not unexpected."
"You're lying," Sebastian replied with increasing agitation. "This is part of the conspiracy. You're all working together to keep me away from Dad. But I know he's still alive. I can feel it." Sebastian's delusions intensified after Orlando Sr.'s death. He became convinced that his father was being held prisoner somewhere, that the funeral was an elaborate hoax, and that everyone involved in his care was part of a plot to keep them separated. "I need to see the body," Sebastian demanded during my next visit. "I need proof that Dad is really dead." "Sebastian, we buried him last week. You weren't able to attend because of your condition, but he's gone." No," Sebastian said with frightening certainty. "He's not dead. He's just hiding until it's safe to come back. And when he does, we'll be together again, just like we always were." I left that visit knowing that my husband was lost to me forever. The Sebastian I had married existed only in my memories, now replaced by this delusional stranger who lived in a reality constructed from grief and madness. But my ordeal was far from over. In fact, the worst was yet to come. With Orlando Sr. dead and Sebastian institutionalized, I discovered the true extent of our financial catastrophe. Sebastian had mortgaged virtually everything to pay for his father's medical care.
The house, the business, even personal property, like my jewelry, and the children's college funds. Olmamwazim. Mrs. Canoe. The bank manager, Mr. Peterson, explained during a meeting that would change my life forever. Your husband took out loans against every asset the family owned. The monthly payments alone exceed the income from the shipping business, and that's assuming the business continues operating at current levels. How long do we have? I asked, my stomach churning with dread. Without immediate intervention, maybe 3 months before foreclosure proceedings begin. 3 months to save my children's future. 3 months to find a solution to debts that seemed insurmountable. 3 months to figure out how to survive in a world that no longer made sense. I sold everything I could, furniture, artwork, even my wedding ring, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the debts Sebastian had accumulated. The shipping business was failing without Sebastian's management, and none of the remaining employees had the authority or expertise to make the decisions necessary to save it. Mom, Orlando Jr. said to me one evening as I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills and foreclosure notices, "What's going to happen to us?" My 17-year-old son looked older than his years, worn down by the stress and uncertainty that had defined his adolescence. I wanted to reassure him, to promise that everything would be all right, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. "I don't know, honey," I admitted. "But we'll figure it out together. We're a family, and families take care of each other."
"What about Dad?" Marina asked quietly. "Is he ever coming home?"
I looked at my daughter, now 16, and old enough to understand the truth, even if it was painful.
"I don't think so, sweetheart. Your father is very sick, and the doctors don't know if he'll ever get better."
Marina nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks.
"I'm scared, Mom. What if we lose the house? What if we have to move away from Canton? Then we'll start over somewhere else," I said with more confidence than I felt. "We're stronger than we know, all of us. We've survived this much, we can survive whatever comes next."
But privately, I was terrified. How does a woman with no business experience, no substantial income, and 4 children to support navigate a financial crisis of this magnitude? How do you rebuild a life when everything you thought you could count on has been stripped away? The answer came from an unexpected source, my mother. Sarah Flowers was nearly 70 years old by then, still living in the same small house where I had grown up. She had watched our family's decline from a distance, offering what support she could, but respecting my wishes to handle our problems independently. But when I finally swallowed my pride and asked for her help, she responded with the practical wisdom that had carried her through decades of poverty and hardship. "Mayana," she said, as we sat on her porch overlooking the Mississippi, "you're thinking about this all wrong. You're trying to save what Sebastian destroyed, but maybe what Sebastian destroyed wasn't worth saving." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your husband's family built their wealth on foundations you never questioned. Orlando Sr. was a powerful man, yes, but where did that power come from? How did he accumulate so much influence in a town this size?" I had never really thought about it. Orlando Sr.'s success had always been presented as the natural result of hard work, intelligence, and good business sense. But my mother's questions planted seeds of doubt that would soon grow into shocking revelations. "Maybe," my mother continued, "this crisis is an opportunity to discover the truth about the family you married into, and maybe that truth will set you free in ways you never imagined." Her words proved to be prophetic. It was Orlando Jr. who made the first disturbing discovery. Now 18 and desperate to help save our family's future, he had begun going through Orlando Sr.'s private papers, looking for assets that might have been overlooked or investments that could be liquidated. What he found instead was evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated under the cover of legitimate business for decades. "Mom," Orlando Jr. said to me one evening, his face pale with shock, "you need to see this." He led me to Orlando Sr.'s home office, which I had avoided entering since the old man's death. The room was filled with filing cabinets, ledgers, and documents that Orlando Jr. had been systematically reviewing. "Look at these," he said, handing me a series of leather-bound notebooks. "They're not official business records. They're something else entirely." As I read through the notebooks, my blood turned cold. They contained detailed records of a loan sharking operation that Orlando Sr. had been running alongside his legitimate shipping business. Money lent at extortionate interest rates to desperate families, properties seized when payments couldn't be made, lives destroyed by usury that made legal banks look generous by comparison. "Ah, there's more," Orlando Jr. said grimly. He showed me photographs, contracts, and personal letters that painted a picture of systematic financial abuse spanning decades. Orlando Sr. had preyed on the most vulnerable members of the community: widows, unemployed men, families facing medical crises, offering them money at interest rates that made repayment virtually impossible. When they inevitably defaulted, he would seize their property, often leaving entire families homeless and destitute. "How many people did he destroy?" I whispered, horrified by the scope of his crimes. "Dozens, maybe hundreds," Orlando Jr. replied. "And Mom, I think some of Dad's recent debts might be connected to this. Look at these names." He showed me a list of creditors who were demanding immediate payment of Sebastian's loans. Several of the names appeared in Orlando Sr.'s notebooks as victims of his loan sharking operation. "They're getting revenge," I realized. "They're using Sebastian's debts to get back at Orlando Sr.'s family. And they have every right to," Orlando Jr. said quietly. "Grandfather destroyed their lives. Now they're trying to destroy ours." The revelation that my father-in-law had been a criminal changed everything. The wealth and status that had impressed me so much as a young woman had been built on the suffering of my neighbors and friends. The respect Orlando Sr. commanded in the community was based on fear rather than admiration. But even more disturbing was the realization that Sebastian must have known about his father's crimes. How could he have worked so closely with Orlando Sr. without understanding the true source of the family's wealth? "Orlando," I said to my son, "do you think your father knew about this?" Orlando Jr. hesitated before answering. "I think Dad knew, but he didn't care. Or maybe he convinced himself it was justified somehow. You know how he was about Grandfather. He could never see anything wrong with anything the old man did." The truth was even worse than I had imagined. Not only had I been married to a man who was complicit in his father's crimes, but our entire family had been living off the proceeds of extortion and financial abuse. I felt sick with shame and complicity, even though I had been completely unaware of Orlando Sr.'s illegal activities. How many times had I enjoyed meals paid for with money stolen from desperate families? How many luxuries had I accepted without questioning their source? But guilt, I realized, was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had 4 children depending on me, and dwelling on past mistakes wouldn't solve our current crisis. "What do we do with this information?" I asked Orlando Jr. "We use it," he replied with determination. "If we can prove that Grandfather's money came from illegal activities, maybe we can get Dad's debts declared invalid. And maybe we can find a way to make restitution to the families he hurt." It was a long shot, but it was the only hope we had. Orlando Jr. and I spent the next several weeks documenting Orlando Sr.'s crimes and identifying his victims. Many of the families he had destroyed were still living in Canton, struggling with poverty that could be directly traced to his predatory lending practices. The hardest part was approaching these families and admitting our connection to their suffering. I will never forget the look in Mrs. Patterson's eyes when I knocked on her door and introduced myself. "You're Orlando Canoe's daughter-in-law," she said with cold recognition. "You're one of them." "Yes," I admitted, "and I'm here to apologize and to try to make things right." Mrs. Patterson's husband had borrowed money from Orlando Sr. 20 years earlier to pay for his mother's funeral. Unable to keep up with the crushing interest payments, they had lost their home and been forced to move into a rundown rental property on the wrong side of town. "Your father-in-law destroyed my family," Mrs. Patterson said with quiet fury. "My children grew up in poverty because of his greed, and now you come here with apologies. What good are apologies to a woman who spent 20 years working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table?" "You're right," I replied. "Apologies aren't enough. But maybe justice is possible even if it's come too late. I explained what Orlando Jr. and I had discovered, and our plan to expose Orlando Sr.'s crimes and seek restitution for his victims. Mrs. Patterson listened skeptically, but I could see hope flickering in her eyes. "You really think you can get our property back?" she asked. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I'm going to try, and if I can't get your property back, maybe I can at least make sure that the people responsible for your suffering face consequences." One by one, Orlando Jr. and I approached Orlando Sr.'s victims, building a coalition of families who had been destroyed by his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming: dozens of illegal contracts, photographs of seized properties, and detailed records of financial abuse that spanned decades. We took our findings to the district attorney, a young man named Robert Hayes, who had recently been elected on a platform of fighting corruption and protecting working families. "Mrs. Canoe," he said, after reviewing our evidence, "this is extraordinary. Your father-in-law was essentially running a criminal enterprise under the cover of legitimate business. The statute of limitations has expired on many of these crimes, but we might be able to pursue civil remedies for his victims." What about my husband's debts?" I asked. "Many of them are owed to people who were victimized by Orlando Sr. If we can prove that those debts were incurred as part of the criminal enterprise, or that they were used to cover up illegal activities, we might be able to have them declared invalid." Hope flickered in my chest for the first time in months. The legal process was slow and complicated, but gradually the truth about Orlando Sr.'s crimes became public knowledge. The Canton Courier ran a series of articles detailing his loan sharking operation, and the community reaction was swift and decisive. Families who had suffered in silence for decades came forward with their own stories of financial abuse. Properties that had been seized illegally were returned to their rightful owners. And most importantly, for my family's immediate survival, many of Sebastian's debts were declared invalid due to their connection to Orlando Sr.'s criminal activities. Mrs. Canoe. Mr. Peterson from the bank told me during a meeting that felt like a miracle. "Based on the court's findings, we're able to forgive approximately 70% of your family's outstanding debts. The remainder can be restructured with reasonable payment terms." I cried right there in his office, overcome with relief and gratitude. But our financial salvation came with a price that went beyond money. The revelation of Orlando Sr.'s crimes destroyed whatever remained of our family's reputation in Canton. We were no longer the prominent Canoe family. We were the family whose patriarch had been exposed as a criminal and whose son had suffered a psychotic break. "Maybe it's time to leave Canton," Orlando Jr. suggested one evening as we discussed our future. "Start fresh somewhere else where people don't know our history." "This is our home," I replied. "Our roots are here, our friends are here. I won't let Orlando Sr.'s crimes drive us away from the place where we belong." But people look at us differently now," Marina pointed out. "At school, the other kids whisper about our family. Some of their parents were hurt by grandfather's business, and they blame us for it." She was right, of course. The sins of the fathers were being visited upon the children, and my kids were paying a social price for crimes they had never committed and behaviors they had never condoned. But I was determined not to let shame and guilt define our future. We had done the right thing by exposing Orlando Sr.'s crimes and seeking justice for his victims. If the community couldn't forgive us for the actions of a man who was already dead, then that was their loss, not ours. "Oh, we're going to stay," I said firmly. "We're going to rebuild our lives here, and we're going to show everyone that the Canoe family can be associated with justice and integrity, not just wealth and power." It was a brave declaration, but implementing it would prove to be one of the most difficult challenges of my life. Sebastian remained institutionalized throughout this entire period, lost in delusions that grew more elaborate and disconnected from reality with each passing month. I visited him sporadically, but each encounter left me more convinced that the man I had married was gone forever. Anna," he said during one visit, looking at me with eyes that held no recognition. "Have you seen my father? He's supposed to meet me here, but he's running late." Sebastian, your father died 2 years ago. We talked about this before. No, that's what they want you to think, Sebastian replied with the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a confused child. Dad and I have a plan. We're going to escape from here together and start a new business in California. He's just waiting for the right moment.
I left that visit knowing that I would never return. The Sebastian I had loved was dead, even if his body continued to exist in that sterile institution.
With our financial crisis resolved and our family's criminal legacy exposed, I focused on rebuilding our lives and preparing for a future that would be defined by our choices rather than our past. Orlando Jr. took over what remained of the shipping business, transforming it into an honest operation that served the community rather than exploiting it. Marina finished high school and won a scholarship to study social work, inspired by her desire to help families facing the kinds of crises we had endured. The younger children, Sebastian Jr. and Marianne, showed remarkable resilience in adapting to our new circumstances. As for me, I discovered that surviving catastrophe had given me an unexpected gift, the ability to help other women navigate their own crises. It started with small acts of kindness, bringing meals to families facing financial difficulties, offering childcare to single mothers, providing a listening ear to women whose husbands were struggling with mental illness or addiction. But gradually, I realized that my experiences had given me insights and skills that could make a real difference in other people's lives. Anna said, Rebecca Walsh, the wife of our former business manager, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for us. When Jim lost his job, I thought we were going to lose everything. But you helped us figure out a way to survive." "We all need help sometimes," I replied. "The important thing is to never give up hope, no matter how dark things seem."
But how did you find the strength to keep going when your own life was falling apart?
It was a question I heard often, and one that I struggled to answer honestly without revealing the full extent of what I had endured.
I learned that we're stronger than we think we are, I said carefully. And I learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the best things we do for others.
Over the years, I helped dozens of women escape abusive relationships, navigate financial crises, and rebuild their lives after devastating losses. My own experience with Orlando Sr.'s manipulation and Sebastian's mental illness had taught me to recognize the warning signs of dangerous situations, and my legal battles had given me knowledge about resources and remedies that many women didn't know existed. We formed an informal network that we called the River Women, a group of survivors who met monthly in my living room to share stories, offer support, and plan interventions for women who hadn't yet found the courage to save themselves. Anna, one of them said to me during a meeting in 1985, "You've helped so many of us. What keeps you going? What gives you the strength to keep fighting for other people when you've already been through so much yourself?"
I thought about Sebastian dying alone in an institution, lost in delusions that would never release him. I thought about Orlando Sr. taking his crimes to the grave without ever facing justice. I thought about Constance and all the other women whose suffering had been hidden behind closed doors and family secrets.
Because every woman we save is a victory over the men who tried to destroy us, I replied. Every child who grows up safe is proof that evil doesn't always win, and every time we choose courage over fear, we honor the memory of the women who didn't survive their own battles.
It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was darker, more complicated, and involved choices that I had never shared with anyone.
Because what none of the River Women knew, what none of my children suspected, was that I had one final secret about Sebastian's death, a secret that I had carried alone for years, and that would change everything if it ever came to light. The official story was that Sebastian had died of heart failure brought on by his psychiatric medications, a common occurrence in patients who had been institutionalized for extended periods. The death certificate was signed by the attending physician. The funeral was small and private, and Sebastian was buried next to his father in the Canton Cemetery. But the truth was different. The truth was that I had killed my husband with my own hands,
and I had done it not in a moment of passion or self-defense, but as a calculated decision to protect my children and secure their future. It happened in March of 1980, nearly 4 years after Sebastian's initial hospitalization. I had received a call from Dr. Richards informing me that Sebastian's condition had deteriorated significantly and that the facility was recommending a transfer to the state hospital, a much cheaper, much more basic institution, where patients with no hope of recovery were essentially warehoused until they died. "Mrs. Canoe," Dr. Richards explained, "I want to be honest with you about what this transfer would mean. The state hospital provides minimal care, and patients there often deteriorate rapidly due to neglect and poor conditions." "How long would he survive there?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer.
It's impossible to say. Some patients live for years, others decline quickly. But given Sebastian's current state of mental fragmentation, I would expect the transfer to accelerate his decline significantly.
I hung up the phone knowing that I had to make a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I could allow Sebastian to be transferred to the state hospital, where he would live in squalor and neglect until his body finally gave out. I could continue paying for private care that we couldn't afford, bankrupting my children's future, to maintain the illusion that Sebastian might someday recover. Or I could find a way to end his suffering and ours once and for all.
The decision, when it finally came to me, felt less like a choice than like an inevitable conclusion to a story that had been building toward tragedy for years. I scheduled one final visit to the psychiatric facility, bringing with me a small vial of liquid sedative that I had saved from Sebastian's home care supplies. The plan was simple: wait until Sebastian was alone, administer an overdose of sedative, and let his death appear to be an accidental interaction with his prescribed medications. But when I arrived at the facility and saw Sebastian for the last time, the plan changed in ways I had never anticipated. The sedatives had worn off earlier than expected, and for the first time in months, Sebastian was lucid, not completely sane, but aware enough to recognize me and understand what was happening around him. "And I know what he said when I entered his room, his voice weak but clear. You came to see me." "Yes, Sebastian, I wanted to spend some time with you." He studied my face with eyes that held more clarity than I had seen in years. "You look sad, tired." "I'm sorry, Anna. I'm sorry for everything I put you through." The apology, coming from a man I had assumed was lost forever, nearly broke my resolve. But then Sebastian continued talking, and I realized that his brief lucidity was actually more disturbing than his delusions had been. "I know what I've become," he said quietly. "I know I'm never going to get better. The doctors think I can't understand what they're saying, but I can. I hear them talking about transferring me to the state hospital. I know what that place is like." "Sebastian, no, let me finish," he interrupted. "I've seen other patients who came back from there. It's not a hospital, Anna. It's a place where people go to die slowly, forgotten by everyone who used to love them."
Tears rolled down his cheeks as he spoke, and I realized that somewhere beneath the madness and medication, the man I had married was still alive, trapped aware and suffering in ways I had never imagined. "I can't go there, Anna," he whispered. "I can't spend what's left of my life in that place. But I don't know how to make it stop." That was when I understood what he was asking me to do.
Sebastian, I said carefully, "Are you saying that you want to die?" "I'm saying that I want the pain to stop," he replied. "I want the confusion to end. I want to be at peace with Dad wherever he is."
I looked at this broken man who had once been my everything, and I felt a grief so profound that it threatened to swallow me whole. But beneath the grief was something else, a cold, practical understanding that Sebastian was right. There was no hope of recovery, no possibility of a meaningful life, no future that held anything but continued suffering for him and continued heartbreak for our children.
"What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely audible.
"Help me," Sebastian said simply. Help me go to sleep and not wake up. Please, Anna. If you ever loved me, help me find peace.
I reached into my purse and withdrew the vial of sedative, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it.
Will it hurt? Sebastian asked.
No, I replied. You'll just fall asleep.
Will you stay with me?
Yes.
Sebastian closed his eyes and tilted his head back, accepting the overdose like communion. I held his hand as the medication took effect, feeling his pulse grow weaker and more irregular. Thank you, he whispered just before losing consciousness. Thank you for setting me free.
And then he was gone.
I sat with Sebastian's body for several minutes, making sure that his heart had stopped completely before calling for the nurses. When they arrived, I was crying not entirely from grief, but from a complex mixture of sorrow, relief, and guilt that I couldn't begin to untangle. He just stopped breathing. I told them. We were talking, and then he closed his eyes, and he was gone.
The attending physician confirmed heart failure, likely brought on by the interaction of Sebastian's prescribed medications with the stress of our conversation. No one questioned the death, no one ordered an autopsy, and no one suspected that Anna Canoe had committed what some would call murder, and others would call mercy.
Sebastian was buried next to Orlando Sr., in a quiet ceremony attended by fewer than 20 people. Our children grieved for the father they remembered from their early childhood, while I grieved for the man I had loved lost and finally released from his torment. In the years that followed, I never spoke of what had really happened in that hospital room. I carried the secret alone, adding it to the weight of all the other truths that I had learned to bear in silence. But as I watched my children grow into healthy, successful adults, as I helped other women escape their own prisons of abuse and despair, I gradually came to believe that what I had done was not murder, but an act of love.
Sebastian had asked me to help him die, and I had honored that request. He had been trapped in a hell of his own mind with no hope of escape and no possibility of recovery. The man I had married, the charming, poetic young man who had swept me off my feet at the county fair, had died years earlier, leaving behind only a hollow shell filled with pain and madness. By ending Sebastian's physical life, I had simply completed a process that had begun long before, when Orlando Sr.'s toxic influence and Sebastian's own psychological fragility had combined to destroy the person he had once been.
Now, at 86 years old, I can look back on that terrible decision with something approaching peace. I don't know if what I did was right or wrong in any absolute sense, but I know that it came from love for the man Sebastian had been, love for the children who deserved a chance at normal lives, and love for myself and the future I was determined to build.
If you're watching this and you're trapped in your own impossible situation, I want you to know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is also the hardest thing you'll ever have to do. Sometimes mercy looks like violence, and sometimes justice requires us to get our hands dirty in ways that saints would condemn, but angels would understand.
I am Anna Flowers, and this is my truth. I have lived through hell and come out the other side. I have made choices that would horrify some people and choices that saved others. I have learned that survival sometimes requires us to become people we never thought we could be, and that love sometimes demands sacrifices that seem impossible to bear.
But I have also learned that we are stronger than we think, braver than we know, and more capable of creating our own salvation than we ever imagine in our darkest moments. Your story doesn't have to end the way mine did. There are resources available now that didn't exist when I was fighting my battles. There are people who understand what you're going through and want to help you find a different path. But if you find yourself in a situation where all the conventional options have been exhausted, where the choice is between destroying yourself and destroying the thing that's destroying you, remember that survival is not a sin. Remember that protecting the innocent is not a crime. And remember that sometimes
the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to be a victim any longer. My granddaughter tells me that sharing these stories helps other women find courage and hope. If that's true, then perhaps the terrible choices I made have served a purpose beyond my own survival. Perhaps the secrets I've carried for so long can become tools for other women's liberation. I don't know if I'll be forgiven for what I did in this life or the next. But I know that my children are safe. My grandchildren are loved. And women throughout this community have found strength and support because I chose to survive rather than surrender. That has to be enough. Until we meet again, remember you are stronger than you think. You have options you haven't considered. And there are women like me, women who have walked through fire and come out the other side, who are ready to help you find your way home. The river keeps flowing, carrying away what was and bringing in what will be. And we keep flowing with it, changed, but not broken, scarred, but not defeated survivors in every sense of the word.